Chapter 3. Gabriel Ockram became Sir Gabriel, inheriting the baronetcy with the half-ruined fortune left by his father. And still, Evelyn Warburton lived at Ockram Hall, in the south room that had been hers ever since she could remember anything. She could not go away, for there were no relatives to whom she could have gone, and besides, there seemed to be no reason why she should not stay. The world would never trouble itself to care what the Ockrams did on their Irish estates, and it was long since the Ockrams had asked anything of the world. So Sir Gabriel took his father's place at the dark old table in the dining room, and Evelyn sat opposite to him, until such a time as their mourning should be over, and that they might be married at last. And meanwhile their lives went on as before, since Sir Hugh had been a hopeless invalid during the last year of his life, and they had seen him but once a day for a little while, spending most of their time together in a strangely perfect companionship. But though the late summer saddened into autumn, and autumn darkened into winter, and storm followed storm, and rain poured on rain through the short days and the long nights, yet Ockram Hall seemed less gloomy since Sir Hugh had been laid in the north vault beside his father, and at Christmastide Evelyn decked the great hall with holly and green boughs, and huge fires blazed on every hearth. Then the tenants were all bidden to a New Year's dinner, and they ate and drank well, while Sir Gabriel sat at the head of the table. Evelyn came in when the port wine was brought, and the most respected of the tenants made a speech to propose her health. It was long, he said, since there had been a Lady Ockram. Sir Gabriel shaded his eyes with his hand and looked down at the table, but a faint color came into Evelyn's transparent cheeks. But, said the gray-haired farmer, it was longer still since there had been a Lady Ockram so fair as the next was to be, and he gave the health of Evelyn Warburton. Then the tenants all stood up and shouted for her, and Sir Gabriel stood up likewise, beside Evelyn, and when the men gave the last and loudest cheer of all, there was a voice not theirs, above them all, higher, fiercer, louder, a scream not earthly, shrieking for the bride of Ockram Hall. And the holly and the green boughs over the great chimney-piece shook and slowly waved, as if a cool breeze were blowing over them. But the men turned very pale, and many of them set down their glasses, but others let them fall upon the floor for fear. And looking into one another's faces, they were all smiling strangely, a dead smile, like dead Sir Hugh's. One cried out words in Irish, and the fear of death was suddenly upon them all, so that they fled in panic, falling over one another like wild beasts in the burning forest, when the thick smoke runs along before the flame, and the tables were overset, and drinking glasses and bottles were broken in heaps, and the dark red wine crawled like blood upon the polished floor. Sir Gabriel and Evelyn stood alone at the head of the table before the wreck of the feast, not daring to turn to see each other, for each knew that the other smiled, but his right arm held her, and his left hand clasped her right, as they stared before them, and but for the shadows of her hair, one might not have told their two faces apart. They listened long, but the cry came not again, and the dead smile faded from their lips, while each remembered that Sir Hugh Ockram lay in the north vault, smiling his winding sheet in the dark, because he had died with his secret. So ended the tenants' New Year's dinner, but from that time on, Sir Gabriel grew more and more silent, and his face grew even paler and thinner than before. Often, without warning, and without words, he would rise from his seat, as if something moved him against his will, and he would go out into the rain or the sunshine to the north side of the chapel, and sit on the stone bench staring at the ground as if he could see through it, and through the vault below, and through the white, winding sheet in the dark, to the dead smile that would not die. Always when he went out in that way, Evelyn came out presently and sat beside him. Once, too, as in summer, their beautiful faces came suddenly near, and their lids drooped, and their red lips were almost joined together. But as their eyes met, they grew wide and wild, so that the white showed in a ring all round the deep violet, and their teeth chattered, and their hands were like hands of corpses, each in the other's, for the terror of what was under their feet, and of what they knew but could not see. Once, also, Evelyn found Sir Gabriel in the chapel alone, standing before the iron door that led down to the place of death, and in his hand there was the key to the door, but he had not put it into the lock. Evelyn drew him away, shivering, for she had also been driven in waking dreams to see that terrible thing again, and to find out whether it had changed since it had lain there. "I'm going mad," said Sir Gabriel, covering his eyes with his hand as he went with her. "I see it in my sleep. I see it when I am awake. It draws me to it, day and night, and unless I see it, I shall die." "I know," answered Evelyn. "I know. It is as if threads were spun from it, like a spider's, drawing us down to it." She was silent for a moment, and then she started violently and grasped his arm with a man's strength, and almost screamed the words she spoke. "But we must not go there," she cried. "We must not go." Sir Gabriel's eyes were half shut, and he was not moved by the agony of her face. "I shall die unless I see it again," he said, in a quiet voice not like his own. And all that day and that evening he scarcely spoke, thinking of it, always thinking, while Evelyn Warburton quivered from head to foot with a terror she had never known. She went alone, on a gray winter's morning, to Nurse MacDonald's room in the tower, and sat down beside the great leathern easy-chair, laying her thin white hand upon the withered fingers. "Nurse," she said, "what was it that Uncle Hugh should have told you, that night before he died? It must have been an awful secret, and yet, though you asked him, I feel somehow that you know it, and that you know why he used to smile so dreadfully." The old woman's head moved slowly from side to side. "I only guess. I shall never know," she answered slowly in her cracked little voice. "But what do you guess? Who am I? Why did you ask who my father was? You know I am Colonel Warburton's daughter, and my mother was Lady Ockram's sister, so that Gabriel and I are cousins. My father was killed in Afghanistan. What secret can there be?" "I do not know. I can only guess." "Guess what?" asked Evelyn imploringly, and pressing the soft, withered hands as she leaned forward. But Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled lids dropped suddenly over her queer blue eyes, and her lips shook a little with her breath, as if she were asleep. Evelyn waited. By the fire the Irish maid was knitting fast, and the needles clicked like 3 or 4 clocks ticking against each other, and the real clock on the wall solemnly ticked alone, checking off the seconds of the woman who was 100 years old, and had not many days left. Outside, the ivy branch beat the window into the wintry blast, as it had beaten against the glass 100 years ago. Then, as Evelyn sat there, she felt again the waking of a horrible desire, the sickening wish to go down to the thing in the north vault, and to open the winding sheet, and see whether it had changed. And she held Nurse MacDonald's hands, as if to keep herself in place and fight against the appalling attraction of the evil dead. But the old cat that kept Nurse MacDonald's feet warm, lying always on the bag footstool, got up and stretched itself, and looked up into Evelyn's eyes, while its back arched, and its tail thickened and bristled, and its ugly pink lips drew back in a devilish grin, showing its sharp teeth. Evelyn stared at it, half fascinated by its ugliness. Then the creature suddenly put out one paw with all its claws spread, and spat at the girl, and all at once the grinning cat was like the smiling corpse far down below, so that Evelyn shivered down to her small feet and covered her face with her free hand, lest Nurse MacDonald should wake and see the dead smile there, for she could feel it. The old woman had already opened her eyes again, and she touched her cat with the end of her crutch stick, whereupon its back went down, and its tail shrunk, and it sidled back in its place on the bag footstool, but its yellow eyes looked up sideways at Evelyn, between the slits of its lids. "What is it that you guess, nurse?" asked the young girl again. "A bad thing, a wicked thing, but I dare not tell you, lest it might not be true, and the very thought should blast your life. For if I guess right, he meant that you should not know, and that you two should marry, and pay for his old sin with your souls. He used to tell us that we ought not to marry. Yes, he told you that, perhaps. But it was as if a man put poisoned meat before a starving beast, and said, 'Do not eat,' but never raised his hand to take the meat away. And if he told you that you should not marry, it was because he hoped you would. For of all men, living or dead, Hugh Ockram was the falsest man that ever told a cowardly lie, and the cruelest that ever hurt a weak woman, and the worst that ever loved a sin. But Gabriel and I love each other," said Evelyn very sadly. Nurse MacDonald's old eyes looked far away, at sights seen long ago, and that rose in the gray winter air amid the mists of an ancient youth. "If you love, you can die together," she said, very slowly. "Why should you live, if it is true? I am 100 years old. What has life given me? The beginning is fire, the end is a heap of ashes, and between the end and the beginning lies all the pain of the world. Let me sleep, since I cannot die." Then the old woman's eyes closed again, and her head sank a little lower upon her breast. So Evelyn went away and left her asleep, with the cat asleep on the bag footstool, and the young girl tried to forget Nurse MacDonald's words. But she could not, for she heard them over and over again in the wind, and behind her on the stairs. And as she grew sick with fear of the frightful unknown evil to which her soul was bound, she felt a bodily something pressing her, and pushing her, and forcing her on, and from the other side she felt the threads that drew her mysteriously, and when she shut her eyes, she saw in the chapel behind the altar the low iron door through which she must pass to go to the thing. As she lay awake at night, she drew the sheet over her face, lest she should see the shadows on the wall beckoning to her, and the sound of her own warm breath made whisperings in her ears, while she held the mattress with her hands to keep from getting up and going to the chapel. It would have been easier if there had not been a way thither through the library, by a door which was never locked. It would be fearfully easy to take her candle and go softly through the sleeping house, and the key of the vault lay under the altar behind a stone that turned. She knew the little secret. She could go alone and see. But when she thought of it, she felt her hair rise on her head, and first she shivered so that the bed shook, and then the horror went through her in a cold thrill that was agony again, like myriads of icy needles boring into her nerves.